Thank you all for coming today. This is going to be, I think, a fascinating conversation. Just to give you a little bit of background on the Speakers Collective and who we are. So we started in 2018 with 17 members. We've now grown to over 100 members, share lived experience on a wide variety of topics. And so we're all about challenging stigma and using our lived experience to challenge that stigma, and really has kind of created this really lovely, growing, supportive community, which means that we're working and talking with different organisations and charities. We put on events like this regular meaningful conversations, and we also have a conference that takes place in Birmingham called the Hope Conference, and it's on the 11th of November. Asif and Joanna also spoke at that conference, and we were at that conference last year. So today's speakers, our meaningful conversation today is pain as an opportunity. We've got Joanna Monaghan, who's a mindful-based core process psychotherapist with a background in international human rights, including working with mental well-being. Is co-founder of Safely Held Spaces. Definitely have a look at Safely Held Spaces and the work that they're doing. It's incredibly important. Joanne's a passionate advocate for empowering mental health in the UK. And Asif Noorani, I'd always love catching up for a conversation. It's the managing partner of Epiphany Productions. It's a behavioural economist and storyteller who supports public and private sector organisations in the inclusion and transformation challenges that they meet. So welcome to our speakers today. I think when this came across, with meaningful conversations, we've covered so many interesting topics over the last couple of years. But when this was suggested, I've got to say I did scratch my head a little bit, and I guess kind of I'll throw it over to you first, Joanne, and why did you pick this? As a conversation to have.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm aware that it might feel a little bit subversive as a topic, I mean, the way it came about was that Asif and I met at the Speakers Collective Hope Conference in November last year, the inaugural conference, and I would recommend people to go along to that. It was a great event. And we started having a conversation about the relationship between hope, which was obviously the theme of the conference, and despair, and how we can both hold the space of hope, that's very important, but also be able to be with the despair in ways that we are really able to take in what it might be trying to show us. And that was the start of that conversation that started at the conference. And because we live quite nearby, Asif and I started to meet for coffee and the odd glass of wine, and to chew the fat on this and to understand really how it showed up in our work and in our lives. And obviously we come from, different perspectives in our working lives and in our lives. And of course, we were meeting in the context of the pandemic and the changes that were happening around the pandemic crisis. And, how our conversation was around, well, how do we allow the pain of this to change us so that we can emerge into a new way of living and being after the pandemic and all the other crises that are happening, rather than returning to how things were before. And I think, as Asif put it, how do we find new balance rather than leaning against a wall? And it was through that we sort of turned it into an inquiry that got called Pain as Opportunity. And I think that came from Asif, but we both thought, wow, that would be an interesting conversation to open up and to see, to share some of what we've been thinking and to see how that lands with other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was such a, it's not really the way you start a conversation. Oh, let's talk about that four-letter word, pain. And I think part of the reason is that the whole meaning of pain has been weakened in our understanding, both socially and culturally, the way that it's been dealt with. And we can always point fingers, but we'll come to that later. I think at the start, I know when we started discussing this, I remembered being a child and on my first shiny bike, and that time when you fall over and you're full of tears. And thankfully, a very sympathetic parent told me, that's the way things are. This is how you're going to learn. You are going to be a better person next time you do this. And it's like, even though I had this grazed knee and I was very cross, my steely determination got me back on that bike. I thought, oh, gone. But I think I wanted to tell us this story because we had an understanding how to manage pain. However, the fear wasn't beyond us. But as we've got older, it seems we've lost all of that. And those intuitive and natural responses to pain have sort of dominated. Our field of vision has narrowed. Pain is not necessarily seen as a step anymore. It's an unwelcome addition, an unwelcome part of our lives. And, it's very, very easy to think of pain in this very blunt face value way, because that's partly how we're tuned to think about it, isn't it? Pain's really volatile, it's hard to predict. But I think we need to be exploring it a bit more. And Joanna's directed me to so many great people to read, one of whom I came across an Indian-American neuroscientist who said, pain is an opinion. Now, if I was in a chronic pain situation, I'm sure I disagree with that. But I think we have to accept that pain, if we look at pain only in one way, that really prevents us from asking, how can this do us some good? Why do I feel this pain? What can I possibly gain from this experience to take me into a new space in my life? And I think, as I say, we've really weakened the meaning of pain, whether it's clinicians who've been playing their part in prescribing us. But I think we have to accept that it's not an easy task by any means, but there's an opportunity for us to reassess our understanding of pain. I mean, that's something we've been batting around for a while, isn't it, Joanna?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, what I really liked that one of the first things you sort of said was, I feel as a society, we've become illiterate in pain. And I felt that felt so important, that it's that we've lost a broader understanding of pain and how to be literate in that, and therefore how to hold different views about it. And I suppose one thing, I know we've shared this before, but I really love this story about how lobsters grow that was told by a rabbi. The understanding, if we think of a lobster, it's really a soft creature in a rigid shell. And, how do they grow? Well, the sign that they need to grow is that they get pretty bloody uncomfortable in that shell, and so comfort is a necessary communication. And if they don't pay attention to that, then there will be there'll be a crisis, because they won't be able to grow. And I think, as the rabbi says, lobsters would never grow in our society as it is now, because pain is a problem. It's not seen as a signal of an opportunity to grow. It's seen as a problem. And in our society, those lobsters, when they start to feel uncomfortable in their shells, they would be medicated, and they would be, they'd be given something to dull the pain. And they may never grow, because without the discomfort, there's no reason to move, to grow. And I think, what's important for me, what I've realized in sort of the mental health sector or arena around this, is that this sense of pain as a communication has been lost. And it's very much that pain is a problem, and that it's a problem to be solved, not a communication to be understood and responded to. This is the illiteracy that you sort of talk about. And I think also, one thing we've talked about quite a lot as well is that pain has been essentially kind of privatized as well. It's become a person's problem. Of course, pain is experienced in the individual, but there's a lot, as I see it, of society locating difficulties in individuals, and then it becomes the individual's responsibility to deal with the problem of that pain themselves. They're the problem. It's about building their resilience to a dysfunctioning society, rather than us all cooperating to address the dysfunctions in society. And I think, this was another thing that came from your work, where it was like, wow, this really connects. You've been working with, I think, government around transport issues. And there was a sense of like, oh, there are transport problems kind of out there. How do we deal with the transport problems? And one of the reframings that really worked was, we are the traffic. It's not a problem to be solved out there. We are the traffic. So, it's about seeing it as the there's something communicating there, and it belongs to all of us.
Absolutely. I think this shared responsibility for the experience of pain, and because it gets always reduced to the individual accountability for dealing with it, I think it's worth flipping it on its head. If we're not in pain, what do we have? We've got comfort. And comfort has been so lauded. You know, this is the life should be full of comfort. And in my work, I realise, you know, whether it's dealing with mobility, inclusion, whatever the change is going on, is people crave the comfort and making sense of the world. And that means just leaning on what we know. Comfort and order are the great things. To be fair, someone said, addiction, when they were describing addiction, called it ritualized compulsive comfort seeking. Comfort is actually a habit that we've got in our lives. And a lot of people that I meet confuse comfort with happiness. I know people who will complain constantly about the situation they're in, but then won't want to move away from it because the fear of not being where they are now is more worrying than the uncertainty of moving somewhere new. And I think, again, we've been given a currency around comfort. I know a lot of it, I mean, we've all got one of these in our pocket, and a lot of it has been heightened since about 2005 by social media and the way that all that oxytocin and dopamine that we're getting fed constantly makes us feel good in the short term. And equally, pain is then something we should be numbing or dismissing. Let's come up with a short-term solution for this. Not let's pull back. As Joanna said, when working with people in traffic, you have to remind them, you're not in traffic, you are traffic. You have to look at the bigger picture here. And if we look at the responsibility for the pain we feel in the greater scheme of things, that might really help us, I think, to understand what are the coping mechanisms that we can use. And in inclusion, the work, say if we're dealing with matters of race or gender or sexuality in organisations, people need to realise this is not a discrete problem that they're dealing with. It's a much greater problem of belonging within an organisation, or how we have compassion or kindness for each other. It's not something that's a project that can be ticked off. And I think in the same way, comfort has to be seen as not the solution that we've got to, but something we have to visit whenever we experience the pain. Going back to the lobster story, if we experience that, that's a prompt for consideration and questioning, as opposed to something to numb and remove immediately.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, we've talked about this a lot, how this, my sense of how this plays out within our understanding as a society of mental health and pain is that, what I've understood is that, the predominant understanding in our sort of mental health system seems to be that, and in our society, is that pain is a problem. And that leads you to an understanding that something is wrong, and it's wrong with the person. And the solution is to diagnose and to fix and to give something, that it's not that the society is dysfunctional, it's the person. But what you're also saying is, we can also see, if we're seeing pain as a communication, like with the lobster, then the question is different. Then we start approaching with compassion and understanding, okay, something's happening, something happened here. It's about listening and understanding. Maybe we understand, there's been some trauma for the person. There's a traumatized society here, And then, to our sort of slightly more radical thesis of pain as opportunity, that's like with the lobster, something needs to change. And I think, the context in which we started having these conversations of the pandemic, and obviously, the Black Lives Matter stuff that had exploded in the middle of that, the ecological crisis, is that, pain as opportunity is pain telling us that something needs to change, and we have to listen and we have to respond. And that's about regeneration. It's pain as a possibility of regeneration, of something new and necessary change. But we don't really see that. And, that's what I saw in the pandemic, was that, there was so much in the press about, there's such an increase in anxiety disorders in our society, in our children. And it's kind of that's the sort of pain is wrong perspective. And it's so narrow what that sees, that, there's a problem and there's pain here, and it's in a person and they've got an anxiety disorder. But actually, we were in the middle of a pandemic and multiple other crises happening. You know, the world was kind of exploding. Our view of how the world was exploding. So perhaps we were understandably anxious, and that it was about, you know, what was happening, and what had happened to us, you know. And then, you know, from the pain as opportunity perspective, then, you know, what is that anxiety? What's that fear telling us about where we are in our lives, in our society? You know, not only me as an individual, but us as a society. You know, we were in a normal that wasn't really working for us. And so that pain was, here's the opportunity for something to change. And that's not to say that it's not painful. Like, we're not denying that. That feels important to say, but it depends. It's just the lens through which it is seen. We need to just open that up a little bit and know, actually, we're looking through certain lenses, and that leads us in certain directions. And I think, you know, until I certainly know that until I got involved in some of this mental health perspectives and my own journey, I think I had a pretty narrow view that feels like the societal view about pain being a problem. So yeah. Yeah. So one thing, yeah, sorry.
No, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just to sort of move it on, I'm just to maybe just why we thought it was important to bring the conversation here, rather than just you and I continually enjoyably having these conversations, why we thought it was important to bring it into a broader arena.
It was, you know, we said we wanted to get it out there because this moment in time, as Joanna said, it's such a, I mean, I don't want to, you know, dilute any of the tragedy of what's happened, but we've got such an occasion to be thinking about change, but the natural motion is just to retreat to the familiar and the known. And the familiar and the known of pain has been, whether it's the sound of a baby crying or an alarm clock, we think, all right, this is activating some behavior, but then I'll move it on, as opposed to thinking about a pain that we feel, whether it's an emotional or physical pain, as an opportunity for growth. And I think, you know, we talk a lot about growth in society today. And, you know, anyone who's done training knows no pain, no gain. This exists in our vernacular, that we do need to suffer in a way. And obviously, the Buddha taught us that natural suffering is part of our existence, part of the difficulties of life. So I think there's a time, going back just to what Joanna said, there's a reframing opportunity here for us now. And it won't happen until we actually have a conversation, which is why we thought a meaningful conversation with yourselves from the multiple perspectives would really allow us to start unpicking this, because I think it needs that sense of nuance now to move from a very blunt world of pain, something to be avoided, you know, in a very disparaging thought, to something, I mean, and the scales of it even, you know, the discomfort to pain, anxiety. We've all, during the pandemic, our vocabulary has become so full of language around pain, but I don't think that necessarily has increased our literacy or our understanding of it. And very often, again, we then retreat to a known word that we then turn into a diagnosis, which unfortunately doesn't move us forward, does it? See, there's somebody, James. So that, yeah, I think this is actually the biggest challenge. James has asked, what's preventing from people seeing the opportunity in pain? And I think it starts with that short-term desire. Very much we're thinking, how quickly will I see the benefit of this? And more often than not in life, we've been told, stick and carrot, what are you going to get rewarded for? How quickly will you see the benefit of this? What have other people's experiences been? And I think when we say to people, I'm feeling this, whether it's an anxiety or discomfort, I certainly know in my world there are very few people that haven't got advice. Everyone's got a solution for this. People don't want to take the time to explore or to consider or to listen. And I think this is what I've certainly found this in my work with corporates, where you're so rewarded for short-term gain that I run a session called Take a Breath for people in big organizations, where we just sit down And we used to be called an unfocused group because I didn't want an agenda to be part of this. I just wanted us to start discussing it. And I think, James, to go back to your question, if we start discussing it, then people can explore more rather than retreat to the immediate response, which is fed by a natural human instinct to eliminate that pain, to numb it, or even to deny it. So I think that's fundamentally why we don't see the opportunity. Any thoughts on that, Joanna? Why are we not seizing this opportunity?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess part of it is the illiteracy, right? So, you know, if there aren't other lenses through which to see it, if there's a predominant lens through which to see it, then we just don't see it as an opportunity. We've been told it's not that. And I guess also it feels painful. Like pain is painful, right? So, and you know, I think, you know, like we may have shut down feeling for a good reason, for a protective reason in earlier parts of our life. That's what I'd say from a sort of more therapeutic kind of perspective. You know, we have good survival strategies, and some of those are stopping us, you know, feeling what's painful. So reopening to what is painful can seem unbearable. And I think at a societal level, it actually feels dangerous, you know, because the fact that pain is implicitly seen as a problem, being vulnerable is weaponized. We see that so much. I mean, I guess that's partly what you see in the corporate world. I'm sure that being vulnerable is not, it's not so welcome. I mean, maybe a little bit more now, maybe the conversation is changing a bit, but we know that vulnerability gets weaponized, it gets othered, it gets labeled. And, you know, going back to our lobster, you know, in between shells, there's a vulnerability, there's a soft body that's vulnerable. And, you know, unless there's an understanding of what you're going through, unless there's places you can go when you feel vulnerable, where your pain is going to be heard and honored, and there's going to be ways that it can be digested and understood. And all of that has to be within the understanding that your pain is not a problem. It's a process. There's quite a lot that's getting in the way of it being able to be an opportunity, that are both sort of personal reasons and societal reasons. And they're about literacy, worldviews, spaces, and practices. You know, it's kind of, we become illiterate, not just in understanding that pain can be an opportunity, but how on earth to process it, and how to do that together, and how to be with each other when we're in pain, rather than reaching for a way to shut things down with each other and to try and make things comfortable again.
Absolutely. I think there's a point actually that Mirabai's raised about privilege, and I'd like to just touch on this because it comes up repeatedly in my work, and I would never pretend that even this discussion doesn't have an element of privilege behind it, because not everyone is in a position to be able to consider those options. But I don't feel, at a very personal level, that doesn't warrant the discussion of it, because the greater we are in our understanding of ourselves and the development journey we're on, the greater benefit hopefully that will be to others. But absolutely, we can't deny that this is something that relies on a certain base of physical safety, of economic safety, in order to be able to go and consider it. And I absolutely agree that must be recognised, because, you know, it's only when in the position that we're at, we can start to say that actually, is this something that we should be addressing? It's the cognitive dissonance we all live by, I know, and it's very uncomfortable. And in fact, it's a pain point that I've used in my own personal development to be able to tackle this. I think, you know, there's a sense of powerlessness out there in the world that I would never start to say, your priority is to be embracing pain, because that's not a valuable statement. However, I do think as a discussion for the people in position of influence, it really can help, certainly in the corporate environments. So there's another question that's come up, and I think this is one, Joanna, that you'll be able, Georgie's actually asked about people processing and working through trauma, and the fact that, you know, there's an enviable aspect of pain, and we've talked about this in the journey when people are trying to release trauma. How is pain accommodated in this? Is it seen as a necessary part of the journey, or is it seen as something that people want to run away from as fast as possible?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think it's sort of all those things we said. It sort of links to James's question about why people don't take the opportunity. You know, pain is painful. I think it is, and that's what makes it difficult. Because I guess maybe what I said before a little bit, but you know, what is trauma? It's when something happens in our life that is too much for us to digest and to process at the time, and so it remains running in our system, in our memory, you know, in our bodies and minds, and you know, the necessary process of kind of healing that requires us to actually go through the pain of what we couldn't digest at that time, and that means that the process can be very, very painful, and you know, I suppose it goes back to what we were saying before. You know, I think we don't always know that there is trauma in our personal system, and certainly we don't understand that there's trauma in our society. You know, I've been quite influenced during the pandemic. Some of the reading, there's a trauma therapist in the US called Resmaa Menakem, who's also an anti-racial activist, and he's very clear that we don't really understand the full impact of trauma. You know, that trauma in an individual, when not seen, is often seen as personality or a personality disorder, and at the level of a family is seen as sort of family dynamics or family traits, and at the level of a society is called culture. And so I think, you know, an essential part of working with trauma is understanding that it's actually there, that it's in the society and it's in us as individuals, that we're running a lot of the time in dysregulation in our nervous system, and that we, you know, there's still not sufficient literacy around trauma. I mean, it's changing, so that there are, you know, there's an understanding that that's what might be happening, and that there are spaces where that can be held, and that there's enough knowledge, you know, not just with specialists but with everyone, on how to be able to process those very painful experiences together, because that's how we traditionally have done things in society. We process things, you know, grief circles were very familiar in the past, and now again we've sort of more privatized pain. I know that I work as a therapist, a lot of it is one-to-one work, but actually where are the spaces where we can process these things together as community?
Absolutely. I think there's a question. There's some questions coming in now. James has got a question actually for you, Joanna, specifically, and then James has got a question as well, which I'd like to go to. Then I'll give you another question from James. But there's James Whitney's asked, how do we stay with pain when it's at its very worst, and how do we learn from it? And one group that have taught me how to deal with that are actually people in the creative industry that I've been lucky enough to work with. I mean, creativity is a torrent of pain for a lot of people, whether it starts with a blank canvas or whether you're getting reviews. And it's interesting just to see the commitment to what's coming next, or to where we're going to be in time, that I've witnessed in creative shoots. And it's interesting that we don't, you know, at a movie, when you look at the credits, there's no manager. There's no such thing as a manager, but there are producers, and producers take friction head on because they understand that this is part of the process. And I think if we are feeling that overwhelming, you know, anxiety and pain, if we can recognize that this is not the end point. The end point is where we're working towards, and that's the aspect of exploration, the trauma that we need to be processing. I think that would be a way of giving ourselves some hope in that moment of despair. And Joanna, James Scurry's asked, do you think those of us in the mental health space looking at these issues, are we becoming more polarized because of something painful we can't seem to look at in the same way? I mean, how do you feel about this division that's going on in mental health around pain? Oh, sorry, I think you're on mute.
I'm wondering if James wants to come on and say something about that, so that we understand better what he's exploring there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the interesting conversation. It's really valuable, and Asif, it's great to have your perspectives. I was just wondering if you think, I'm just really mindful of how uncompassionate we can be to each other when we're kind of having these conversations. And I sometimes see, sort of saw it on social media today, sort of terrible behavior that, you know, we as clinicians would never dream of, in ways we'd never dream of acting with our clients or with, you know, people in normal mental health spaces, yet with each other, we kind of seem to retreat behind these kind of ramparts. And I'm just wondering and it seems to me like it's getting worse and potentially even more vitriolic. And I'm just wondering, is there some pain in the way we've all been slightly complicit perhaps in colluding with different ways of understanding mental health, which we have to kind of accept have actually hurt people, have actually been quite damaging. And I'm just wondering, is there blame going around and shame that's stopping the very people that maybe need to do a bit of healing work from actually acknowledging that they've been part of hurting rather than healing?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I mean, I think, you know, maybe it speaks to what Asif was saying about the sort of cognitive dissonance, that somehow we're trying to manage, you know, contradictions in ourselves in terms of how we sort of deal with these issues. And I know that, you know, just to sort of cite an example from the mental health field, that there's a new sort of way of working that's coming in, being trialled in the NHS, called open dialogue, which is a way of working with people and their families when they're experiencing extreme states, and sort of opening it up as not that there is you know, pain is not a problem, but it's a communication within the family system, and that actually it needs dialogue between all of those and all of the people in the family system, in terms of, you know, what's happening and what's trying to be communicated here and what's trying to grow and emerge. And I know that's been quite challenging, bringing that into the sort of the existing mental health system, which is operating under a sort of largely under a paradigm that pain is a problem, that something is wrong and that something needs to be fixed. And I know that that's caused, you know, for those existing clinicians being trained in that approach, that's been really difficult to manage, in the sense of, you know, they went, I'm sure, with good faith into a training that has taken them down a road that talks about pain as a problem and psychiatric drugs as the solution to the problem. And so that's the basis on which they've been operating. And, you know, they go in presumably, to support people to heal and at least to do no harm. So I think to suddenly, you know, come across an approach that is really challenging the way you've been operating in good faith for a long time is very internally challenging. There's a dissonance there. And I know that as part of that process, a lot of, you know, I sat in on a room with a training where there was just the shame in the room was palpable, that, my God, I didn't come into the service to cause harm, but I can see that maybe I have been. But that's not a shift that everyone can make or make easily. You know, it has to be done in a way that shame can be processed. So I know as part of the training in open dialogue, they've started offering groups for clinicians who are training together to actually air that shame and the pain they're feeling about the pain they've caused. And that's an essential part of their process to be able to then be involved in offering this sort of open dialogue approach. And I guess maybe that also, you know, maybe some of that speaks to the other question, which was like, how do we stay with our pain when we don't have resources? I mean, that's very hard. I think, you know, ideally we meet our pain in community with others. And so, you know, there really need to be more of those spaces where people can actually have, you know, speak to their pain, have it honored and digested together in community.
It's great. There's a question Ros raised. Ros raised a really interesting dilemma, I think, that's on the horizon at the moment. Though I can't say that I've got much to really add to this, apart from a few festivals experiences. It's many other psychedelic therapies that are being developed at the moment. There is talk, isn't there, of this turning point in potentially in how we go and deal with the pain. How it's a paradigm shift essentially. I mean, what experience have you had any contact with this at all, Joanna?
Yeah, I have, and I think it's, for me, it feels like it's at an interesting moment because, it depends. For me, I went to a conference called Breaking Convention, which was kind of looking at these new psychedelic assisted therapies. And obviously the use of psychedelics is as old as the psychedelics themselves. And, they've been used in sort of ways that are around growth, traditionally that in ways that are around growth. So a growth mindset, like, actually, as ways to break through barriers and grow and change and see what needs to change. And, famously, I think that Gail Bradbrook, who's the founder of Extinction Rebellion, went and did some psychedelics in, I think in Ecuador, Peru, in order to kind of try and sort of understand how to create the change that has become Extinction Rebellion. That was part of her process. So I think, they and when you look at the way they work on the brain, oh, hi, I see Roz is actually the press officer for Breaking Convention, so that's good. So, when you see the way they work on the brain, what they do is, I've seen certainly with psilocybin, which is one I have more experience with, it really breaks this default ruminating network that we have. So it really creates an opportunity to grow and to change and see something different. It's really our lobster breaking out of its shell and the possibility of thinking differently. I suppose what was interesting to me, hearing some of the speakers at the Breaking Convention conference I went to 2 or 3 years ago, pre the pandemic, and also what you see in the media is whether the therapy itself, the psychedelic itself, will be captured by a different kind of mindset. So, if you see pain as opportunity and a psychedelic goes into that mindset, that's very different to seeing pain as a problem to be solved, and this psychedelic is just another treatment modality to solve a problem that needs to be fixed. So I suppose that's my sense of it, that the worldview, whether it's pain as problem, pain as communication, or pain as opportunity, really, really matters.
Georgie's raised a fascinating point, actually. I think if we reduce all questions, they come back to mind, body, and we talk a lot, obviously, about mental, emotional pain, but there's a whole issue as well around how we manage physical pain. And the truth is that it's the same brain feeling it, whether it's an emotional pain or it's a physical pain. And there's still quite a lot of work being done, isn't there, around understanding this and not just seeing it, as you say, Georgie, as a medical problem when we're talking about physical pain. I mean, have there been any examples that come to mind of when a physical pain has been attributed directly to emotional trauma? Or
yeah, it's not completely my area, but yeah, I mean, there's in areas where there's complex trauma, there can be a lot of physical pain that goes with that. And I suppose what I want to say in response to that question is that, I guess mainly you and I in our conversations have been talking about what might be broadly termed emotional pain rather than physical pain. But I guess there's something about the pain as communication certainly runs across both physical and emotional pain, as that there's a communication that something is happening and that something needs to change. But I would still say it doesn't, for me, fit within the idea that there's a problem to be fixed. It's still a communication.
And I think, again, so just going back to the issue of the privileged conversation, very often when people are exploring physical pain for groups who are not necessarily with the opportunity to spend time exploring this, it does get reduced, doesn't it, more immediately to something that can be solved medically, or something that can be, I mean, I think we experience it. It's an interesting time because we hear about microdosing in the corporate world as well. And there's so much conversation going on in this space that I think this is an opportunity for us to start saying, and, Joe Watson's made a point about, we need to be discussing this in the round with not just people within our own networks and who are sharing this conversation because they have the opportunity to do so. And I think, I was actually at an interesting meeting on Monday where we were talking about the link between hospitals and social care. And when I raised this issue, straight away people felt very nervous because there hadn't been a discussion around it. And it made me very wary of just who we're attributing responsibility for those unheard voices in community at the moment around mental health and physical pain.
Yeah. And I just to pick up on what Joe said, I'm just reading it now, is it not important to say that not all pain leaves much space for opportunity? It can be all encompassing, at least at the time it's being experienced. Does this need to be acknowledged more loudly so that people aren't left feeling dismissed or alienated from the discussion? Yes. Yeah, of course. We were aware that what we were bringing was a sort of a provocation that was, there are multiple elements to it, and that actually in the moment, yes, it doesn't feel like an opportunity. But I suppose what we're trying to, where I come from is that if that worldview isn't even held as an opportunity, then there won't be the spaces and practices available when it's not all encompassing to be able to let that pain allow an opportunity to come. And I guess that's something in the mental health system is that the opportunity is not, because it's not held as an opportunity, it's held as a problem. Then the opportunity for people to explore it, to see what the opportunity is. And here I'm talking about emotional pain, not physical pain, although I think James has, put a link to Gabor Mate's book about, when the body says no, which explores this in more depth. So I think, yes, in the moment when things are all encompassing, yes, it doesn't personally feel like there's an opportunity at all. And yet, I suppose what we're talking to is what broader view does society hold? And I suppose what we've been discussing is that if society doesn't hold that view, then there's no opportunity at all. And this, pain becomes only problem.
Yeah, I think that for me is the challenge. Is that it's not regarded as a social cultural issue. It's still being regarded at that individual level, as you raised earlier, Joanna. And I think and this again is when we start to talk about it as a social cultural issue, is when we start to then see and realise that there are marginalised, oppressed groups. There are people who are not part of this conversation. But I think that's the very first step in opening this discussion, to realise actually that not everyone is being included in it at the moment, because pain for certain groups is something that's just a short-term problem to be solved. And then there are other groups who can start to talk about it, but still retreat to short-term solutions, because that's again how we've been culturally coded to deal with things. And I think that the conversation, we have to be talking about pain as a pathway to something that we want. And I think part of the challenge that we've got, particularly in the UK at the moment, which is the only country I can really speak confidently about, but is where we don't really have a vision of where we're going to be in a few years from now. Post-pandemic, there's still so much chaos and the maelstrom and people getting very binary about things, when actually we should be discussing it in a much more dialectic way, as we're hopefully doing today.
Yeah. I think there's another question. I'm just sorry, I'm not very good at multitasking. What work needs to be done to support others through their experiences of pain? Do you want to have a?
Yeah, well, I think for me personally, it's not physical pain again, but when I've come across pain in the work that I do or in people that I know, it always starts with not sympathy, but more empathy and compassion. I mean, sympathy is, oh, I see you in pain, as opposed to the empathy and the compassion that needs to appreciate where that's come from. And I think that discussion is not really going at the moment because people just jump to a solution. Even though we're illiterate about pain, we all feel like an expert. That's part of the challenge. I'm an expert in my own pain, even though there's literacy around it. So we need to be exploring more and understanding pain in order to be able to address it in the right way. And I don't think that that's how things are tackled at the moment. People just jump to an answer, and certainly our health service is partly responsible for that also.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I guess that's that, going back to that earlier question about jumping to an answer. It's that psychedelics are the new answer. And that's to say that they can't be part of a vision for a way forward. But until we've had the conversation about, and not to sound like a broken record, but like, how can we be literate? Like, what's our worldview on pain? How do we understand it? And understanding where we all are with it and where we're speaking from when we speak about it, that feels really important, and I know that doesn't feel like, but if I'm in pain now, how can that experience be helped? But actually, I think what we understood when we started Safely Held Spaces as an organization was that, people experiencing pain, and the particular pain we were looking at were people in extreme altered states that gets called psychosis, was that people might, well, at best, not always, be in spaces that were kind and compassionate. But if they didn't hold the same worldview as the person going through the experience, if the person was understanding their experience as an opportunity for something to grow, horrifically painful, but something wanting to express and grow, something needing to change, then being in a safe, compassionate space wasn't really enough, because it didn't hold, it was kind to people, but it didn't hold the worldview that they held, so it automatically shut something down for people. So, I think that for me remains very important, that kind of worldview. But then obviously, in actual fact, it needs spaces and it needs practices, to be able to be with pain. And I think for me, there's actually quite a lot we can learn from the environmental movement. I've also been very influenced by a person called Joanna Macy, who's like a bit of an elder in the environmental movement, who developed, really went through 2 years herself of understanding the despair of the situation of the climate crisis many years ago, and she sat with her despair for a year, because she thought, I can't share this because I will bring other people down. And so finally she shared with others her despair and found that others were feeling the same, and went on to develop a whole set of practices called the Work That Reconnects, which I'd really recommend people to look at, just because it's outside of your area and my area, but it links into both, around group practices around how to honor and process pain together, and through that to go forth with everything that pain has taught us about what is needed. Speaking to your idea of the vision, it feels like we can't make a vision until we understand what the pain of this situation we are in is trying to teach us. And how do we do that if we think pain is a problem? We don't have the tools to do it.
And I think that's actually, there's a Marina's actually asked about, mentioning that her parents never really shared their emotional pain, even though they were experiencing it, as part of a route to protecting children. But what I've heard from in recent months, in fact, and people have had more time with their children than ever before, is that actually pain is an easier conversation. We've got more permission to talk about it through the shared experience of the pandemic, actually. And I mean, there's some great work by Sherry Turkle at MIT, who talks about this generation as the most connected, but the most isolated in history. And it's fascinating to sort of see it is pain, but it's got a new context to the pain that we unnecessarily grew up with. So I think there's an opportunity to start talking about pain in a new way with young people. That's actually one where we're learning ourselves. Therefore, it's a discussion as opposed to instruction or running for a solution. And I think that, you know, that's been a thread of the discussion this afternoon. If we start opening that door and giving people permission to talk about it, then we instigate the conversation.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think, you know, some of the people I sort of work with one-to-one or in, you know, or in groups, you know, those kind of conversations between parents and children around like an honest reflection of emotion and the sense that it's okay, there's not a problem here. There's not a problem. It's, you know, and to see when pain can be expressed and held and someone can be with it without it being made into a problem, I think that's very healthy. That's what I've seen in my.
Right, how are we doing on time, John?
Yeah, so we've got just a couple more minutes now. So if you've, there's, I think the final kind of questions coming in. It's been, a fantastic conversation. I guess as we bring this to a close, so is there anything else that you wanted to mention on this topic? It's been, say, brilliant listening to everything that's been discussed, and thanks again for all the questions that have come through the chat. But I guess, any kind of reflective thoughts on this conversation?
I think one thing to stress, and it's why it's such a great thing to have the meaningful conversations at the collective, is this is not really about specificity at the moment. It's still, we're talking about almost the mood and setting the climate for discussion around pain. And it's great to see the links. Thanks so much, Joanna Lacey's stuff and stuff from the Psychonauts. I mean, there's a lot here for us to start thinking about. And I think when we start discussing this out there, so much more is going to emerge. And at the moment, pain is, you know, the blame for pain usually sits with an individual. And I think I would love to be able to continue discussing how the social cultural responsibility for pain gets accepted. Therefore, we understand we've all got a part to play in seeing pain in its true context. And part of that, not all of it, especially with physical pain, but part of that is an opportunity for growth, because without pain, there is no growth in our lives. We're just standing still.
Yeah, no, very important point. I've just listening to the conversation, I've been writing down notes and really thinking. It's been a really great hour listening to you both speaking and challenging some of the thoughts that I have in my head around pain and how I personally have dealt with it in the past. Joanna, just a couple more minutes left. Anything else to add from your side that we haven't had a chance to cover at all?
Yeah, I mean, I just say just one thing I just wanted to highlight just in the chat I saw from Elizabeth Svanholmer about the danger of seeing pain as part of growth is that you get caught up in seeing how much pain I'm in as a marker of whether I've done enough or the right kind of work, whether it's personal development, community involvement. So I think that's just a really interesting point about how everything can be captured by our sort of sense of needing to self-improve. And so I think that's, you know, it's really important to see that even pain as opportunity becomes a problem to be solved somehow. You know, my God, we're so tricksy. Our minds and bodies are so tricksy, basically. So just I wanted to acknowledge that because that just felt like a very important comment. And then the other thing just really to say was just, you know, thanks to the Speakers Collective for bringing Asif and I together, because otherwise we wouldn't have started having these conversations we've found fascinating. I hope it's been interesting today and opened things up. And I think, you know, for me, what would be important is, you know, just to be able to take these ideas further within the Speakers Collective and have those kind of conversations. Because I think one of the reasons for bringing it here was that the collective is an amazing collection of people who are speaking about pain and discomfort quite widely in institutions, in schools, etc. And I think it would be helpful to have more of this kind of conversation with the members of the collective, because if, as you know, Asif's saying, we're going to become more literate in pain, we need to do that work ourselves first as a group if we're speaking and sharing with others. So yeah, that's, I guess I'd say this is just the start, it feels like.
Yeah, no, it really is. It just, you know, I think over the past, the different meaningful conversations that we've had, maybe slightly ahead of where kind of wider media is talking about these subjects. And I love the fact this is now another one in the series where we're starting to have this conversation, but it very much still feels like it's in its infancy. And yeah, I guess you know, I love the fact that the whole idea of the Hope Conference that we did in November, where we were unsure with things all opening up and then closing again, that you two had met through that conference, and that really what the idea of the Hope Conference is. It's supporting individuals, campaigners, people that are grassroots, and trying to bring that connection together. So it's lovely to see that you've built that kind of friendship or kind of understanding, kind of talk around these subjects. That was very much with the Speakers Collective what we had in mind for that. And so have a look at hopeconference.co.uk. It's the 11th of November this year, again in Birmingham. So final bit as we hit the hour is just first, Joanna, just thank you so much, and Asif, for your time today. How can people find you? How can people find Joanna first, I guess, Safely Held Spaces?
Yep, it's Safely Held Spaces, and info@safelyheldspaces.org. So I don't know if you're able to just put that in the chat, John. Maybe not, don't worry. But it's safelyheldspaces.org or info@safelyheldspaces.org. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And Asif, how about yourself?
I've got a very terrible social media footprint, but LinkedIn, Asif Noorani, Epiphany Productions, not Asif Noorani, the very famous Karachi journalist, which is a crossover that happens a lot. But yeah, that's the easiest way to get hold of me. But thank you again, everyone. That's been really fruitful discussion.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Again, thanks very much. You can watch this back. It'll be available as a podcast, and also at speakerscollective.org/events, and you can look at some of our other meaningful conversations. So again, thanks very much for listening, and I wish you a good day wherever you may be listening or watching this. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Bye.